One where I got 800 hours of combat time in this airplane in models. Let's see, what were the D, E, F, and G, and I mostly flew in the E and the F, and the E and the G, which we like the best anyway. The D and the F had variable pitch prop, which had a big hub on the nose right here. Of course, that was another place to get hit and get in trouble. And so, and it made it heavier. So for the little power you got with the variable pitch prop, it wasn't worth it to have. So we like the fixed pitch prop that this is right here. And we flew mostly E and G's.
How did you find out that you were first I don't know, how did they tell you, because you were already in the military, that you were going to be going to be shipped out?
Shipped out where?
To the war.
Oh, well, I was at Homestead Air Force Base in B-52s, and I got orders came down for Vietnam, and with training up in North Florida, in Panama, not in Panama City, but in Hurlbut, right near Pensacola, and went through training there. I forget what it's called there, Special Operations Group training and forward air control training there. And then went on there to Vietnam.
Did they, did the Air Force prepare you for Vietnam at all? That type of country?
No, well, one of the things that they didn't really prepare me for, they prepared me well to be a forward air controller, but what they didn't prepare me for was for ground combat. I found that when I was with my advisory team in Rockjaw that we ended up manning the walls about every other night for ground combat, and they had never trained me for that. I qualified with the M16 on the rifle range, and that was about the extent of my ground training. And so that was one of the things that I wasn't prepared for. And I ended up, because I was uncomfortable where I was, I ended up going up on the top of the roof of the building and setting up a defensive post up there. I was more comfortable being higher and where I could see more, and that was much more comfortable. I didn't feel like I was confined, even though I could possibly be trapped up there. But that was what we really weren't prepared for. And then of course, every day I flew, I was shot at. It's not like that was an infrequent occurrence. And but that was just part of what happened as a forward air controller. I was assigned to a Vietnamese provincial battalion, and which pretty much stayed in their province all the time. And then some regular Vietnamese Army battalions would come in every now and then for special operations, which I helped out with. In fact, I got my DFC for saving one of those battalions in a night attack bivouac on them, and then through a timely air attack. But that was also where I got my airplanes all blown up. The attack on the battalion was coordinated, was to be coordinated with an attack on our little airfield. But whatever happened, something changed the timing of everything, and I was able to get off before they attacked, and ultimately saved the battalion. And I got back and landed, and I didn't know they were lying around the bush waiting for us. But they didn't attack me when I was there because they were waiting on the other airplanes to land. And I ended up heading back down the road to our quarters when I heard shooting break out back at the airport. And that's when my boss, who was on R&R, came back and found out that I just got his brand new airplane blown up. And he never forgave me for that. It was the best flying airplane he ever had. But it was in fact, I have a picture of it. So I saw a picture of it the other day somewhere.
At the house?
Yeah. It just shows the tail. That tail was anything left. Burned out hot airplane.
Oh my goodness.
But
well, what was like your daily routine? Where you were
oh, daily
stationed?
routine. Pretty much, we would fly. We get up, go to breakfast. Of course, we're always available for emergencies, like anything else. But normal routine: get up and go out on reconnaissance in the morning. Try and stir things up a little bit to see what was happening, because they were smart enough by that time not to mess too much with the forward air controller. So you had to kind of stir them up. My technique was to suspected places where I thought they might be would be to drop smoke grenades or something like that and make them think I saw them. so that they would fire on me. And when they fired on me, then I knew they were there. And that was my intent. But sometimes I could see through their camouflage. It was interesting that I was in a place, a resupply route from Cambodia, and they did their camouflage work in Cambodia, and by the time they floated down through our province, the camouflage had changed, but they didn't realize it. Didn't seem to realize it. And I didn't know it at first until you first saw the difference, and from then on you always could tell the difference. Then you knew what you had there, that you had phony camouflage out there, you would attack them. But I remember attacking a sampan convoy loaded with supplies going down the route, and dropped a 500-pound bomb from a fighter down on top of it. It looked like it would have blasted the whole place apart. But as the smoke cleared, that you saw those sampans just bobbing around in the water from the. It almost takes a direct hit to do anything on them. But anyway, that was I was in a resupply province area where they were along a resupply route that came through Cambodia and down into the rest of Vietnam. And yeah, the story goes that our province chief got 2 paychecks, one from the government and one from the Viet Cong themselves. And so there was that thing going on. So you had to be careful what you were doing, because and you tried not to get too routine in things. You wanted to change your habits because you didn't want to get in such a steady thing that they would be waiting for you somewhere. And because of the threat of anti-aircraft fire, we would always take off from a little airfield and spiral up in a circle, climbing till we got to altitude, just to keep from getting fired on. And the other thing was that if we had to go low to look for something, we always stayed low, because you're harder to hit low because you go out of their sight faster. And you didn't want to start climbing up until you were in a safe area that you could climb up. And like I said, I got shot at every day. Small arms fire sounded like popcorn going off around you. And then, of course, heavier stuff, the 50 caliber and heavier stuff, whoom, 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 heavy stuff, you could hear too. They say that if you could hear those sounds, that means that those bullets were within your air envelope, which means they were pretty close. But I really never got shot down or anything like that. And both times I was wounded, I was on the ground.
I wanted to ask you a few questions this morning about your Vietnam experience. I understand that you were wounded a couple of times. Could you give us some information about that, please?
Yes, I was wounded twice in Vietnam. And the first time I was in country in September of 1967 when I arrived in country, and I went through FAC school at Ben Tui in the Delta. And while we're going through school, we got our assignments to go wherever we were in Vietnam. And my job was to stay in the Delta to go to Rock Jaw and become a part of Advisory Team 54. And so that's where I went, and I'd been there about a month when one afternoon I was called out and had to put in an airstrike in part of the province. And I got back late, and I knew that I was going to miss chow if I didn't do something. So I called the radio operator and asked him to call in and have them hold chow for me at the mess hall. And so that's what they did. And the time I got into the mess hall, I was the only one there besides the mess sergeant, and there was a Vietnamese mess boy who was serving him. We had just sat down and I had just started to eat when I heard pop, pop, pop outside. But I knew that the Vietnamese were very fond of firecrackers, so I thought, well, that's probably what that is. But on the other hand, I better be safe. So I got up and went into the hallway, which is just a few feet away, and to get my guns, which is where we normally kept them when we went into the mess hall. And just as I got in the hallway, I saw a door just about 5 feet away, a screen door open, and out come 2 grenades come rolling right at my feet. And so that I didn't have time to think, didn't have time to do anything other than I reacted. I just jumped through the doorway that I just come through, and the blast blew me back into the kitchen. And I've got a flesh wound to my thigh, and pretty much not too bad, but I didn't know what was going to happen. I thought next that the enemy infantry were going to be charging through there, and they were going to shoot us all. And I was really very felt very satisfied to see this little Vietnamese mess boy come and stand over me with a carbine in his hand, and he was going to protect me. And I felt good about that. And then the mess sergeant went out into the hallway and got our guns, and we got there, and we didn't have a charge in like we thought. We pretty much after initially we went through the hallway that was blown pretty much to not smithereens, but it was shredded pretty good. And I remember walking over a fuse box at that screen door, and then going outside to take up a position outside for a defensive position. But what turned out to be kind of providential is that fuse box was not a fuse box, but a satchel charge. And that satchel charge fuse had burned down to a kink in a fuse and burned out. Otherwise it had blown the whole building apart, which is really what they were about. It turned out that they had killed our Vietnamese guard outside with a pistol. They were like saboteurs, I forget what we call them now, but they were dressed as fishermen, and they had a big bowl of fish, and underneath the fish were hand grenades, pistol, and then the satchel charge. And so that's what and when I kind of caught them at the door, I guess as they were putting in the satchel charge, that's when they grabbed the first thing they could, and they grabbed 2 grenades and came in. And that was the first time I was wounded, and in a way that was very providential, because it probably should have killed me. Because they turned out to be Chinese concussion grenades rather than American frag grenades, and of course the frag grenades are much more lethal than the concussion grenades. So I was pretty well saved from that for whatever reason. Then the last time I was wounded was during the Tet Offensive of 1968. I was wounded a second time in Vietnam, and it was later on in my tour of duty there. As a matter of fact, I had been asked to come back to my squadron, the 22nd Tactical Air Support Squadron, and be the Assistant Operations Officer and the Flying Safety Officer. And so I did that, and we were stationed at Ben Thuy Air Base in the Delta still. And so I was there performing my duties, and of course during the Tet Offensive we got shelled almost every night, running for the bunkers. I remember one evening I was running for the bunker, and a shell hit behind me and blew me into the bunker, and then another time we got a direct hit on the bunker, but it didn't penetrate. But anyway, one evening I was doing my normal routine. This is very early before going to bed, that I would be sitting at my desk writing a letter home, and I'd gotten a little nauseous, and so I went to lie down in my bed, and just as soon as I got on the bed, the whole room exploded, and it turned out to be they started shelling us with a howitzer, and I heard the first round go out somewhere around the flight line, and the second round came down right on top of us.
4 rockets per station, 16 rockets, and then they added a third station in which we would carry a night flare on each wing in case we wanted to had some night mission. I got hit a few times. All the time that I was hit, they were back in here. Here. Took hits. But never anything lethal. Had an Army pilot who flew the Army version of this AL-19, who got shot right there, and went right through his shoulder. And then he made an emergency landing at another airfield. He was stationed at Rockchaw, where I was also, in the 4th Corps. The 01 is a tail dragger, as you can see. 212 horsepower Continental engine. Carried a lot of radio gear. We carried 1/4-inch armor plating underneath the seat. That was the only protection we had. This is one of the more vulnerable areas. This is the oil cooler. You get a hit in here, you're going to lose your oil. Pretty soon you're going to be in trouble. Your engine will seize. And I never had that. I've had some problems with the engines, but nothing like that. The interesting little tidbit here. Come on over here so you can see. Guards all the time. My crew chief would put little grease pencil marks various places to make sure no one had opened the engine hood up. And if the marks were there, then we had to look around and see if it was booby-trapped or sabotage.
The whole room exploded as I had almost put my head down on the pillow. And I had heard the first shell go off as it hit in somewhere in the flight line, and then the second shell, I guess it was, came right on top of us. And it actually exploded right over my desk. Had I been at my desk, as I would have been, it probably would have killed me. But as it was, I was wounded pretty severely in the legs. I had shrapnel sprayed all over me and ended up breaking my leg and pretty deep wounds. But I thought, my biggest worry at the time was I thought I was going to bleed to death, because I was, and because I wasn't sure when the next shell was coming in, I also had slid off the bed and got underneath the bed. And I remember on the floor slipping around in my own blood, and I was beginning to wonder if I would bleed to death. But very quickly, some other Air Force people came by and said, "Anyone hurt in here?" I said, "Yeah, we need some help in here." My roommate had been there too and had been lying down. He got hit on the head. I got sprayed in the legs and the chest. And so it ended up being my, what they call the glory wound, in that I got to come home early, because I wasn't going to be totally healed until my tour would have been over. And so that they sent a C-130 down that night and medevac two of us up to Air Force Hospital in Cam Bay. And there they had surgery and they removed the shrapnel and kind of closed the wounds and recovered a little bit. Stabilized me, and then pretty much I got to come back to the United States, and they asked where I wanted to go. And I wanted to be close to where Diane and Lisa were, so that who were in Valdosta, Georgia, so that closest Air Force base was actually Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. So that's where they sent me. It was interesting. I came back in a C-141 Aerovac. We stopped in Yokota, Japan on the way back, and then up in Alaska we refueled again. And then came all the way across to Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, where we spent the night in the hospital there. Then the next morning it was very interesting for me, because we went out to another medevac airplane, but it turned out to be a West Virginia Air National Guard C-121 medevac airplane, and so they took me in that down to Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. And that's how I got wounded. And then I had a couple surgeries down there and convalesced, and then eventually was released from the hospital and assigned to Blytheville Air Force Base, Arkansas, and B-52s again.
This is the cockpit if you wanted to come around and see the cockpit. Breaker panel and the switches are on the not dash, but panel, front panel. On all the other models, they were over here on the side door, or on the side, and that's where I was used to seeing them. There was an instructor in this also. I flew in the left seat. You couldn't see ahead of you at all on the ground, so when you're landing in the back seat, you line up on the edge of the runway and just keep lined up on the edge as you land.
What was the country like, though? Because you've never been to Vietnam before.
It was interesting that I had come from Homestead Air Force Base when I got my orders down in South Florida. And it was interesting that the weather and the climate was very similar to South Florida, although it was more tropical. When I arrived there and started my work in Rockjaw in the fall, it was the beginning of the monsoon season, which meant rain all the time. So it was challenging to be able to direct airplanes in and around, because you had to not only worry about ground fire, but around the thunderstorms and things like that. And so that was interesting. And also one of the things I also did quite regularly was I would fire artillery. In our little province, it's about as big as a county, we had about 5 different district offices, and they all had batteries of artillery. And I would call each one up and fire and see if they had any fire missions they wanted me to spot for them. And you always had to remember when you shoot artillery that you have to set up an orbit parallel to their gun arch. You know, you don't want the guns shooting at you, because they're using variable timing fuses, which means they explode in the air. And for an airplane, that would just be like AAA exploding around you. And I've had that happen where they exploded prematurely, and I didn't have a spray me with shrapnel, but they could have. And so that was interesting. And
Where did you guys do R&R?
well, and we all knew that in our year's tour, and we were only committed for a year, that was the supposedly nice thing about Vietnam, is that we only knew we had to be there for a year. And being in the Air Force, they told us, and everyone kind of knew that as a general rule. There are always exceptions, but for the Air Force, you only had to do one tour in Vietnam. Now, I ran and worked into people in the Army who had been there 2 and 3 times, so they had repeats. But we generally knew in the Air Force that this would be our only tour that we'd have to do. So that was kind of nice from that perspective, is that we knew we were there for X number of days, 365, and then we could be going home. And
What movie you think depicts the Vietnam War the most? We Are Soldiers, Apocalypse,
no, I don't like the Apocalypse.
Platoon,
I liked Platoon, I think it was.
The Enlist. That was in the
And
one that was
it
the
made me
enlistment.
appreciate particularly the guys on the ground, which I was not one of, actually. I was in the air supporting them, and and the dirty gruesomeness. I was with the Vietnamese Army, who generally did not stay out in the field overnight, but the American Army stayed out in the field day in and day out, and so that was very difficult for them. But the conditions they experienced were those which we would see around us as well. So that, and of course, being in the Delta, kind of the big rice bowl of the Southeast Asia, we had a lot of dike lines and canals and rice paddies and all that kind of stuff, very flat, with a few mountains here and there.
How did you guys feel about being in the war when you were there?
Well, we didn't want to be there, but we knew it was our duty to be there, and so we just did our duty and knew that we did that, we would come home and probably never have to go there again.
But did you feel you were doing the right thing?
Oh, there's nothing good about war, and so that people get killed. I know that I killed innocent people, and I know that several people that I knew were killed. They told us in my class, my fact class, that 40% of us would not be coming back from our tour, but it turned out to be closer to 10%. And my class didn't make it. But so that you know, you want to say that you're fighting to stop the flow of communism, but that's not really what we thought about. What we saw out there is that I saw, I should say, is that the ordinary rice farmer out there just wanted to be left alone to raise his crop and feed his family, kind of thing. And in a way, that we thought we were kind of trying to make that possible for him, but it turned out that we were just not helping that much with that. So it also turned out that I went back to Vietnam, not to Vietnam actually, back to Southeast Asia about, what was it, about 2 years later in B-52s. And I flew 6 months out of Thailand, a couple times out of Okinawa and Guam, and flew B-52 missions out of there. And so in a way I went back, although it was quite a bit different. Because in that route you'd take off and you were under danger for an hour or two, and excitement kind of thing, and then you go back and have air-conditioned quarters and showers and good meals and the whole thing. So it wasn't too bad. But there were several times that we got exciting. We were attacking the Mugia Pass, which was along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, kind of a well-known place. They say that the pictures of it look, because of all the bomb craters, it looked like the face of the moon. But we were attacking the Mugia Pass, and I was number 3 in a 3-ship cell of B-52s. And when we were flying over Laos, a enemy height finder radar came up and swept on us once before we jumped on him, and it got our height. And then, but that was several hundred miles from our target area, so we didn't think that much about it. We just thought it just happened. But when we got in the target area, we were attacked by surface-to-air missiles, and I remember our flight. We were in the middle of bomb release when they launched their missiles. That, excuse me.
Is that the president?
Communications.
The deputy province commander would fly with me a couple of times, and he always wanted to bring an M60 machine gun. So we'd open these windows, and he would shoot out the back windows with it. I was always afraid of that because I didn't know him that well. I was afraid that he was going to shoot off my struts on one side or the other. And the Air Force didn't like me doing this because the linkage and the spent shell casing would fly back into the back and possibly jam your controls. So that was considered somewhat of a no-no, but obviously we all did it. This window over here is where I would, with my grease pencil, I would write up my briefing I was going to give to the fighters who were coming into target. I'd get target information, expected resistance, and also particulars, you know, of what this airstrike was about. And that way I didn't have to think about it. It was already there. I just kind of read it almost. We flew pretty much level 2,000 RPM, and I have it trimmed up, but I have maps I was having out because always you need map coordinates for something to target. And so I flew with my rudders. I just mushed around when I wanted to turn, and I flipped the elevator trim so I was level. And I had a lot of radios to deal. I had FM radio over here, and ADF, UHF, and VHF over here on the other side. And then the Corderich armor plating was right underneath the seat. That was an add-on by our squadron. I carried my M16. This model doesn't have it, but there's a little handle there that emergency exits the door, kicks out the door. But we carried our M16, or in our case ARA-15, right there in. It was a nice little holder to be able to keep it there. And then when I would occasionally fire out my window, but I want to make sure I didn't hit that strut. And with an M16 with a small magazine, it was mainly just to let them know we were there.
What were the ways you were able to contact your family back home?
Of course, we would write, and then in Vietnam, when I was there, we sent back, what were they? They were tapes, but they were not the cassette tapes before that, little
The reel-to-reel
reel-to-reel tapes, yeah. And that we would talk that way. Of course, it was a one-way conversation, but it was nice hearing the real voices. And then when I was in Thailand, I think it was, that I was able to call back using what they called MARS stations, Military Armed Forces Radio or something like, whatever it is. But anyway, they're military ham stations who would contact someone in the United States who would then call to whatever you wanted them to call. And so you got to talk, but you had to use, you know, terms of communication like over, so you couldn't be talking against each other. You couldn't talk and hear at the same time. It was one way from that perspective. And there was a bit of a delay to it. It sounded like an echo. But that's what we did once or twice. This was before satellite communications made it easy for that to happen now. But so that was primarily the way. Of course, mail was very important, and one of the things I did is that when I was a forward air controller is that if I happened to have to fly back to a main base, I would make a point of going and picking up the mail for our advisory team, because that was always a very big morale booster for everybody. And several times I would haul back the mail bag in my back seat of my airplane for the folks. And of course I wanted to see what was in it myself. And it was always nice to have letters from home. I remember Christmas there, and this little tree that we had that somebody had sent for Christmas. I think there's another picture of that somewhere I saw the other day. And that was a kind of a morale, kind of a, it was kind of a contact with home Christmas tree, because that's pretty much of a foreign environment. Some of the folks there are Vietnamese, were Roman Catholic, but predominantly they were non-Christian, and so having a Christmas tree or anything like that was not something that they participated in or even were aware of. And so that was kind of fun. And also the candies and the things like that that you couldn't get in Vietnam, that was nice to get. But you had to be careful not to get the fresh candies, because the ants were just everywhere. And so you had to have them in nice tins or something like that. And the other interesting thing about where I lived in an old, almost a mansion kind of house for, they said was a Chinese merchant of some sort. Very nice place. We had all 50 of us live there, so it was, every room was partitioned into little 3 or 4 bunks and a desk or two. And but the other inhabitants of that were these big lizards, and they must have been very big, but they were nice to have because they ate a lot of the insects. And so that, but I remember looking up in the rafters, seeing this big tail squish around, and wondering what does the rest of it look like. Yeah, but we had mosquito nets, and part of the mosquito nets was to protect us against any kinds of rodents or anything like that from getting in too. So that that's how we slept. And
How'd they build the airfield?
our airfield was unusual in Rockjaw because it was just a little 2,000-foot airstrip, very narrow, probably about 25 feet wide or less. But it was built right outside, right on the edge of town. But unfortunately, the main road going into town went right down the middle of the runway, crossed it right almost exactly at perpendicular. And so that one of the things that we did in order to land there was we would buzz the field, and the Vietnamese guards would lower the gates to keep the pedestrian and automobile traffic and truck traffic from going across the runway. And then we would land. That made it quite somewhat unusual. And the only good part about it was right almost in town, right on the edge of town, which was good. We didn't have to travel great distances out in the open to get back and forth.
You don't know what happened to the original inhabitants of the house, the mansion?
No, I assume that the government requisitioned it from them.
Nobody had any stories there out of the 50 people?
Oh no, the people that we came in contact with were kind of the Vietnamese peasants who would polish your shoes and that kind of sweep the floors. And but we were told that in Delta particularly there were a number of rich Chinese merchants, which, and by the way, in their culture the Chinese were not particularly liked or loved by the Vietnamese, because the Chinese had ruled over them for over 1,000 years as lords, and they looked down upon the Vietnamese historically anyway. So there was probably a little bit of animosity between it. But on the other hand, many of the people that lived in the city of Rockjaw were actually Catholic. That apparently had been Christianized with the Europeans that came in. And that was about it.
Lisa's behind the camera, but when she was about 3 or 4 years old now, I forget which, when we were at Blythe, Arkansas, I flew B-52s then, but I also flew these with the Aero Club at Blytheville, T-34. And we went cross country. You and your mom went over to Athens to visit your Aunt Linda. I don't know how you got there. I guess you must have flown commercial. And then I came over later, about a week later, in a T-34 from Blytheville across the top of the South into Athens. Landed there and picked you and your mom up, and we flew on to West Virginia. And somewhere over the mountains of West Virginia, oh, one thing about it, a couple of the indicators were broken and it was written up, so I knew about it. One of them was a flap indicator for the flaps. And so that somewhere over West Virginia hills, this T-34 went like that, and I didn't know what the heck was wrong. Then I realized that I looked out the side and could see that the flaps were down, and that somewhere along that mountains there, Lisa in the back had kicked the flap handle, because the back has complete controls as the front. And so Lisa and I just pulled the flaps back up, and that's what it was. That was the time that Lisa kicked the flap handle down. That's moving around. This was also the airplane when I was in West Virginia that I took all my family a ride, except my mom. She didn't want to go. One of the memorable ones was I took my dad in the back seat with little Bobby, who was just small then. And it was in the wintertime, and little Bobby had a coat and one of those sock hats, or some kind of long hat. And I took Dad over Cheat Lake and Cooper's Rocks. It was a little bumpy. Dad said he began to eye little Bobby's hat to use the barf bag, but he was able to hold his lunch, and we came back okay. And then I guess I took everybody else for a ride, and that was what memorable about it. And then when we came home, I did a no-no, and I tried to impress my parents and whoever else was there as we were getting ready to leave. So I didn't use the checklist, I just tried to do it from memory, and I forgot one item. I forgot to turn the fuel pump on. And so trying to start it, I would grind and never catch it until I finally ran the battery down. And so I had to get a jump start from maintenance there in Morgantown. And then I realized what I'd done, because I went back to checklist and I turned the fuel pump on. And finally got it started. Then we flew from there, and we landed in Lexington, Kentucky, and refueled, and then went on to Blytheville. That was a good trip. I really enjoyed that. Lisa also liked it too. Didn't get sick. And